my biggest pet peeves is when people are talking about Shakespeare or other writers from, the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the 19th century, whatever the case may be, and they use these two words, Old English. Shakespeare did not write in Old English. He did not speak Old English. Shakespeare spoke early modern English. Does that surprise you? It surprises a lot of people. I've even heard Jane Austen referred to as Old English, but really, Jane Austen wrote in modern English. Modern English goes from about the 18th century through the present day. Basically, it's English that sounds mostly like we speak it today. So, no these and thous, no weird verb tenses like thou art, thou shalt, and so on and so forth. Some words may change a little bit. For instance, Sense and Sensibility, the Jane Austen novel. In the title, you actually need to understand that sense meant logic and reason, and sensibility meant emotion. So it's referring to the two sisters being super different from each other in their personalities and their outlooks on life. But that's a small difference, a very minor thing where one word has changed its meaning. Most of what Jane Austen wrote is actually pretty easy for the modern reader to understand, as opposed to something that Shakespeare wrote or something that Chaucer wrote, for instance. Charles Dickens also wrote in modern English. The Declaration of Independence, modern English. Lots of things that you might think of as very old and antiquated and Old English, they're actually modern English. But Shakespeare's work isn't modern English in the same way that Jane Austen or Charles Dickens are. His work is actually early modern English, which goes from about the 15th through the 17th centuries. Early modern English is moving closer to modern English. Usually it's fairly understandable to the modern reader, but there's a lot more as compared with those works from, say, the 19th century that may not be understandable. For instance, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? We don't usually use shall as much anymore, but that's still, you probably know what that means. But thee instead of you, that's something that's very characteristic of early modern English as opposed to modern English. And if you're thinking, oh, so the these and thous and whatever, that means the King James Bible, right? You're absolutely right on. The King James Bible is also written in early modern English. With early modern English, you usually need some kind of notes, footnotes, endnotes, whatever the case may be, but you don't usually need a translation. You might get one. You might, for instance, decide to do Spark Notes No Fear Shakespeare, where they have the early modern English and the modern translation, side by side so that you can compare. But people also do read Shakespeare just with the original text and with some footnotes to explain things where the meaning isn't clear or where you need some historical context. Okay, so you're thinking, but anything before Shakespeare, that's Old English, right? No, actually Middle English would be the period right before Shakespeare. Middle English is generally thought of as beginning around the time of the Norman Conquest and going up through the end of the Middle Ages. During that period, a lot of French words are imported into English, and that is why, even though English is a Germanic language, it takes a lot of its vocabulary from Latin via Old French. And the works from that period, they're usually much harder to understand for the modern English speaker as compared to the early modern English, but you probably can still pick out some words and get the general meaning possibly. The Canterbury Tales is a good example of this. If you look at the introduction to the Canterbury Tales in the original language, you probably can pick out some words. But unless you have studied Middle English, you might actually need a translation in order to understand what's being said, because there are a lot of things that are spelled very differently, and there are also a lot of things where this just isn't a word that we use anymore. Old English goes back even further. It's the language that the Anglo-Saxon people spoke before the Norman Conquest, so no influence of French or Latin, just that really early language that you can't even read anymore unless you have specifically studied it as a second language, or you have a translation of it into modern English. So two well-known examples of literature that's written in Old English are Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I'm going to put some text from Beowulf on the screen, and I challenge you to make any sense of what it says without actually looking at a modern English translation of it. Yeah, it's pretty different. There are still, there are words in the modern day that come from Old English, but they're few and far between. A huge amount of our vocabulary actually comes from Latin via Old French, and the spellings, pronunciations, and grammar have evolved over time. So next time you start thinking about Pride and Prejudice, or Hamlet, or even the Canterbury Tales, and you're thinking, oh, Old English is so hard to understand, my advice would be count your blessings that you're not actually having to read Old English in the original without a translation. So I hope this video helped to clear up any misconceptions you might have over whether Shakespeare wrote in Old English. If you liked it and you would like to see more from me, feel free to subscribe. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays.